Welcome to Exegetical Tools Basic Greek videos. In this video we're going to be looking at the imperfect active indicative. So there are four different components to the imperfect active indicative. One is the augment, and that is something that's very characteristic of the imperfect and the aorist tense forms. So there are really only two tense forms that use the augment, and so it's there's also the pluperfect, which is a third, but it's a very rare form, so it's also combined with the reduplication, and we'll learn about that later. So generally when you see the augment, it's going to be an imperfect or an aorist. It's going to use the present tense stem. There's no different tense stem for example, like an imperfect tense stem. It just uses the present tense stem. So for a verb like balo, for instance, the present tense stem is bal with two lambdas, and the imperfect is also going to use that same stem, beta, alpha, lambda, lambda. And then there's going to be a connecting vowel, variable connecting vowel, omicron or epsilon. And then it's going to have the secondary active personal endings. So the secondary active, you'll remember, the secondary endings are used for the tense forms that are more correlated with past time. They're not always necessarily past time verbs, but the aorist and the imperfect both use secondary endings, for example, and they're usually cast into past time, although not always. So secondary relates more to past time, although not completely. And you'll remember those endings, which we'll see here in a minute, on, esse, mente, on. So we're still in the indicative mood, and the indicative mood describes something factual or asks a question or states an opinion. You've already seen this with the present active indicative. So it's the exact same thing there. We're still in that indicative mood. And the imperfect tense form, like the present tense form, expresses imperfective aspect. So don't get confused between imperfect, which is a tense form, and imperfective aspect. Those are two different things, but the imperfect tense form does express or encode imperfective aspect. An imperfective aspect displays the action as incomplete. There's no focus on the beginning or the end of the action. A lot of grammarians like to express the difference between imperfective and perfective aspect with the analogy of a parade. So perfective aspect would be your view of the event if you were in a hot air balloon far above the event and you see it as one complete whole, whereas the imperfective aspect is akin to being on the sidelines of the parade as it unfolds before your eyes. You have an internal perspective within the event itself. You can see the details. You can see the inner workings of the event. You're very near to the event. It's very vivid. That is what the imperfective aspect expresses. Now the augment. Let's talk about the augment for a moment. The augment has quite a few different rules. Often it's simply going to be just an epsilon, as you saw up there. But sometimes it's going to change. Sometimes it'll lengthen. Sometimes it will, in contact with other letters, change. And so there's a few rules we have to look at for the augment. In Koine Greek, it does generally, perhaps always, but perhaps not always, there's some debate about this, but the augment generally indicates past time, but it doesn't always, because you can see some aorists with an augment, for example, that are present tense time or future time. So the augment doesn't always indicate past time, but as a general rule, those words that have an augment generally are expressing past time. There's a reason for that, but no need to go into it here. It's tied up with the verbal aspect debate. Now, let's look at these rules for the augment. If the verb begins with a single vowel, it's going to lengthen. So that's verbs like agapao, egero. So vowels alpha and epsilon are going to lengthen to an eta. You can see that right here. And an omicron is going to lengthen to an omega. So the alpha and the epsilon are both going to lengthen to the eta, and the omicron within the O class will lengthen to basically a long O sound, which is an omega. Vowels over here, these four vowels, eta, iota, upsilon, and omega, lengthen but do not change to a different vowel. So they become long, but they don't actually change. They're still going to look the same. So for example, agapao begins with alpha, and that's the initial alpha is going to lengthen to an eta, and that is the augment. And then with agero, same thing, the epsilon is going to lengthen to an eta. So sometimes you're not just going to see an extra epsilon hanging out at the front of the verb. You're going to have to spot it within a contraction. But usually you can spot that because the gayer, this gamma, epsilon, iota, rho, looks very familiar. That's part of the stem of agero. And so then you see the eta there and you think, oh, well, perhaps that's maybe that's a lengthened epsilon. That's kind of the process you go through to recognize an augment. Now, how about verbs that end that begin with a diphthong? Let's talk about that for a moment after we clean this up. Now, if a verb begins with a diphthong, lengthening still occurs. So if you have the diphthong I, alpha iota, or A, epsilon iota, it's going to lengthen to eta with a subscript. If you have oi, it's going to lengthen to O with a subscript. So you can see that iota is still there, it's just subscripted. So basically it's the same rule as above where the alpha and the epsilon lengthen to an eta, but then the iota just gets subscripted. Same thing with the omicron goes to omega, and then the iota, which comes after the omicron, goes under the omega as a subscript. And then you have two other ones, alpha upsilon and epsilon upsilon, which change to eta upsilon. So in this case, it's the same kind of thing as the iota, except the upsilon doesn't subscript because only iotas can subscript. So the first letter of the diphthong will lengthen according to the normal rule, and then the upsilon just stays there. You still have the upsilon there. Okay, so this is somewhat, as long as you can remember the first rule, the alpha, epsilon to eta, and the omicron to omega, then it's generally pretty easy to recognize. So with eucharisteo, for instance, you have eucharisteo with that epsilon, upsilon, and then eucharistun. So the epsilon changes to an eta, and you still have the upsilon. So it's somewhat recognizable. It's in that case, it actually just looks like the first rule where epsilon changes to eta, but it is an actual diphthong, so you have to remember that. Okay, now if the verb's a compound prefixed by a preposition like katabino, the augment's going to occur between the preposition and the verb. It's not going to be e katabino or something like that, or e katabinon. It's going to be katepainon, like this. So you can see the alpha has been replaced by an epsilon. And that's a case where, because it's in the middle of the word, the augment, the alpha has not changed to an eta, but it's just changed to an epsilon. Or rather, a better way to think of it actually is that instead of having there's not a lengthening, this is actually just the alpha dropping out. So you had katabino like this, and then what happened is the alpha has simply dropped out and the augment has been added. I guess in the reverse order, the augment is added, and then because you have this kateebino, the alpha is just going to drop out like that. Okay. So hopefully that wasn't confusing, but this is not a lengthening, this is a replacement. The epsilon augment is added, and then the alpha drops out because it's too difficult to pronounce. So that's what happens with compound verbs. You'll find the augment in the middle between the prefix and the actual verbal stem. There's two sub-rules to this. If the preposition ends in a vowel, like katabaina that we just saw, the vowel will usually drop out. It doesn't always drop out. You have peripateo, which then you can see here, periepatun. So generally that iota from peri would drop out, like with other verbs, and you would get something like perepatun. But this is a special kind of verb where that doesn't happen, so that iota stays in there, and you get periepatun. Okay, so every once in a while you'll get verbs like that. And lastly, you can have a prefix. The prefix ek will change to x, so that's something to remember. So instead of ekebalon, you'll get exebalon. It's just easier to say, I suppose. I'm not sure really the rationale behind it, but that's just what happens with Greek. It's probably because for pronunciation reasons. Exebalon. Okay, so those are the two different rules for compound verbs. Now let's go down and actually look at the paradigm. So you can see in all these cases, you have the augment here. You have the stem, which is the present tense stem. For luo, it's lu. Luo has pretty much the stem lu for pretty much every form, so it's very regular. But if you had something like balo, like this, that's the present tense, that's the present active indicative, first person singular. And you'd use the same stem for the imperfect, and then you would add the augment, and then you would add the endings, the connecting vowel in the first person singular or third person plural ending, ebalon. So the connecting vowel here you see is the variable. It's just like the present active indicative, the omicron epsilon variable. And then the personal endings, these are the secondary active personal endings, and you need to know these. Remember, there are 4 sets of endings. There's the primary active, there's the primary middle passive, there's the secondary active, which is where we are now, and there's the secondary middle passive. Those are the 4 sets of endings. So we are right here right now with the secondary active. And that's on, in order to pronounce them, you really need to add the connecting vowel, although you should memorize the actual endings themselves, because you don't want to combine them with the connecting vowel. For instance, because with you can have a different connecting vowel. You can have an alpha connecting vowel, you can have no connecting vowel. So it's best to learn the endings on their own because of what happens in other tense forms. So here are the endings on, es, e, omen, ete, on. So you kind of have to add the connecting vowels in order to pronounce them. There is an alternate ending, son, for the third person plural, and that shows up, for example, in the third person plural of ami, which is ason, when it's in the imperfect indicative. So ason rather than simply ain. But in most cases, it's just going to be that new ending. So here we can go down and clean this up a little bit, and then we can pronounce this. So let's say the forms. This is eluon, elues, eluen, eluamen, eluete, eluon. Those are the 6 forms. If you happen to have BibleWorks, you can always go into their Greek Paradigms module, and you can open it up to the imperfect, and then you can listen to the audio files. You can listen to them pronounce the forms for you, which is nice. It's good to simply listen to the forms a bunch of times. It helps you to remember them better if you can use different sensory organs like your ears, your eyes, your hands to write it out, your mouth to say them. So that's one good way to help memorize it. You should simply just spend some time writing this out. So just start writing these out, eluon, elus, etc. So write that out multiple times. Make sure you have this paradigm down, because the imperfect is pretty frequent in the New Testament. It's a very important paradigm to have down. And you don't want to ever confuse it with the aorist tense. The aorist and the imperfect have the augment. As I said, the pluperfect also does, but that's a very complex form with a reduplication as well. So you don't need to worry about that too much, and it's pretty rare in the New Testament. So when you see that augment, you need to be able to tell the difference between the imperfect and the aorist. So this is one good reason to really have this paradigm down. And as far as the translation, since it has the imperfective aspect, you're not always going to have this kind of I was loosing translation. It's not necessarily, but I'm trying to capture in English that vivid sense of the action unfolding before one's eyes. And so typically in English, if we're wanting to do that, we'll use the I was loosing kind of language. So for example, if I'm telling a story about going to the store and I want it to sound very vivid, let's say I was doing it yesterday, I might even use the present tense to make it more vivid and say, okay, so I'm going into the store and I'm going up to the counter and I'm talking to the clerk, and all of a sudden a man bursts through the door with a gun. And so I'm kind of laying out the story before your eyes as if the action is unfolding, and then it's all building up toward this final action of, and a man walks through the door with a gun. So anyway, that's one way to do it, to kind of express this imperfective aspect in English a little bit. It doesn't directly correspond, but that's why I'm translating I was loosing, and often that's how you'll translate an imperfect, is with some sort of to be verb like was, and then an ing. I was loosing, I was walking, he was saying, they were doing, that sort of thing. That's not always the case, but that's the best rough translation I can get here. Okay, so that's it for the imperfect active indicative. So just remember, these are the four constituent parts. It's very very important to remember what makes up the imperfect active indicative, that it's these four things right here. And then very important is to get down the rules for augments. This whole section right here is very important. Review those rules and try to come back to those every now and then. They're very important for you to be able to recognize forms like this, for instance, Eucharistun. Being able to recognize that eta is an augment is very important for you to be able to correctly parse words as you come to them. So that's it for the imperfect active indicative. Thank you very much for watching the video. Hope it was helpful, and we hope to see you back again.